What's up, guys? Nick Whalen here from RotoWire. In this video, we're going to talk about 5 basic points to keep in mind to help you dominate your fantasy football drafts this season. Don't overpay for a quarterback. And I'll issue a disclaimer here. This is my personal opinion. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, they were on plenty of successful fantasy teams last season. But in general, given the depth of the quarterback position in the NFL right now, you don't need to burn a high pick on a quarterback. This especially applies to highly drafted quarterbacks who don't present a ton of rushing upside. So we're talking guys like CJ Stroud, Jordan Love, Joe Burrow. If you're taking CJ Stroud, for example, as the 5th quarterback off the board, you take him at the end of the 4th round, you essentially need CJ Stroud to have an all-time elite passing season just to return that value. And in terms of raw production, Stroud will likely outpace whichever wide receiver you could take with that pick. I get that, but it's not really about the raw fantasy points when we're talking about a 4th round pick. Keep in mind that in the vast majority of leagues, you're only starting one quarterback, whereas you may be starting 2 to 3 running backs or 3 to 4 receivers, including your flex spot. Not only do you need more starting receivers, but there tends to be a steeper drop-off in production as you get deeper into that receiver player pool. Having an elite quarterback, of course, it gives you an advantage, especially if it's someone like Josh Allen, who lapped the field at quarterback last season, but it's all about opportunity cost. What value are you leaving on the table to draft that early quarterback? To me, it's not worth sacrificing the chance to add an impact running back, an impact receiver, even one of the top tight ends in all of fantasy football to grab a quarterback when there are several viable fallback options available 60, 80, even 100 picks later. Bottom line, if you're taking an early quarterback, make sure it's the one you think has a viable path to being the overall QB1. If you're taking the 5th QB off the board in round 4 and he tops out as maybe the QB4, then it's not worth the investment. You're better off sacrificing 2 or 3 fantasy points per game and grabbing a lesser but still very viable fantasy quarterback later in the draft. You want to try to mitigate risk as much as you can throughout your fantasy drafts. And this is easier said than done, of course, but if you take some risks in the early to mid rounds, make sure you're doing what you can to insulate yourself from potential disaster. So let's say you take a chance on Anthony Richardson or Caleb Williams or Jaden Daniels at quarterback. If I do that, I want to ensure I'm landing a steady veteran backup later in the draft in case of injury or just a straight up bust season, which happens. It can happen to any young, unproven player. If you take a high upside player with some injury or workload risk like Devon Achane in Miami, you got to burn a 2nd round pick on him. If you do that, consider pairing him with one of his teammates like Raheem Mostert or Jalen Wright later in the draft. That's what we call a handcuff. If Achane goes down, you have yourself some protection right there. Mitigating risk, it also applies to how you build out your roster throughout the draft. If you're in a PPR league and you take a running back in round 1, you're likely going to want to hammer the receiver position over the next 2 to 3 rounds to ensure that you're not falling too far behind the pack. And keep in mind, in PPR leagues, receivers tend to be much higher floor flex options as well. If you go heavy on receivers early on, make sure you're addressing your running back room in the middle rounds, but be cognizant of value and don't just blindly take a running back because you need to fill one of those starting spots. Running back production and health, for that matter, tends to be really volatile. I'd rather grab a top-tier tight end or the number 1 wide receiver and even a middling offense over a 3rd or 4th tier running back. Keep in mind that last season, players like James Cook and Kenneth Walker, who could come off the board in round 4, even round 3 this season, those guys provided virtually the same per-week fantasy production as Brian Robinson, who goes 4 or 5 rounds later. You certainly don't want to wait too long on running backs and end up with backs in a timeshare or guys who are on the decline, but don't sacrifice value elsewhere just to fill a starting spot too early in the draft. If you're enjoying this video, please give us a like. Please subscribe to the RotoWire Fantasy Football channel. That helps us out immensely. You can check out all of our content over at rotowire.com. Rotowire.com/try gets you free access behind the paywall. Do not tie yourself to default rankings or default ADP. If you're in multiple leagues, you play on multiple platforms, you'll notice just how much ADP and default rankings vary from site to site. And part of that difference is scoring and roster settings, but some sites will meld together multiple league formats into one set of composite ADP or composite rankings, and those figures are likely to be completely different from how your league operates. So I would suggest putting together your own rankings before the draft or use a custom rankings tool like ours over at rotowire.com. You put in your league settings, you put in your roster settings, it'll generate a custom set of rankings tailored to your specific league. And while we're on this topic, don't feel like you need to be a slave to ADP. I'm not suggesting you jump ADP by 20 or 30 picks, but if you're picking at, say, 35 overall and you really like a player, but he typically goes in the early to mid 40s, don't pass on him just because it's a minor reach. Maybe you'll get some people getting after you in the chat. Who cares? If you've done the research and you're confident in it, go get your guy. Fantasy football would not be any fun if everyone just went down the list and took the best player available If you like Amari Cooper over Stephon Diggs this season, go right ahead. Take Amari Cooper over Stephon Diggs. Please wait until the final 2 rounds of your draft to address team defense. Team defense, kicker, these should be your final 2 picks in just about any draft. And this may seem like an obvious one, but believe me, I do a lot of drafts. I see plenty of defenses going outside those final 2 rounds. Later in drafts, I want to take as many shots as I can on upside running backs, upside receivers, maybe build out a little bit of depth. Guys who, I may end up cutting a couple weeks into the season, but also players who have a conceivable pathway to making an impact. And we're talking about roll of the dice type of picks late in drafts. But if you hit on one of those guys, it's going to provide you significantly more value than burning that pick on a defense. When it comes to defenses and kickers for that matter, the upside, it's pretty limited. And it's often very much unpredictable week to week. Like the quarterback position, the top defenses can give you an advantage over the field, but there tends to be a ton of volatility with team defenses week to week, and most of it is matchup based. On that note, do not overly tether yourself to the highest ADP defenses. Your goal is to maximize that defense roster spot on a week-to-week basis. And that means you have to be prepared to cut bait with the team defense on any given week, which is part of the reason I want to limit my draft investment on that position. You may like the Ravens defense, for example. They're one of the highest drafted defenses this season, but 4 of Baltimore's first 5 games come against the Chiefs, the Cowboys, the Bills, and the Bengals. Are you really comfortable starting Baltimore through that entire stretch? You got to take a look at the schedule. You got to be ready to drop and pick up a defense based on which teams have the best matchups each week. Last season, over the course of 18 weeks, we saw 16 different defenses post the highest fantasy score in a given week. The number 1 overall fantasy defense, the Dallas Cowboys, had 6 weeks last season in which it posted 2 or fewer fantasy points. That's 1/3 of the entire year where you didn't really want to be starting the Cowboys. Just because you drafted a defense doesn't mean you have to stick with that defense.